The guests expected a perfect wedding, but when a young boy stepped forward and exposed his father's dark secret, everything changed in an instant. What he revealed left everyone speechless. The grand ballroom of the Langston estate was a spectacle of opulence, draped in silken curtains and lit by the golden glow of chandeliers. Waiters moved in precision, serving expensive champagne to guests adorned in designer attire. The air buzzed with polite laughter and murmured conversations as the wedding of William Langston, a renowned billionaire, and Isabella Reed, a socialite with a reputation for cunning ambition, was about to take place. Seated quietly in the corner, away from the festivities, was Ethan Langston, William's 12-year-old son. Dressed in a crisp suit, his small hands clutched the edge of his chair, his young mind overwhelmed by the grandeur of the event. He had been forced to attend this wedding. Despite his growing unease about it, his heart pounded in his chest, not from excitement, but from the weight of a secret he had uncovered, one that could destroy everything. The ceremony was minutes away from beginning. William stood tall, shaking hands with influential figures, his face an image of charm and confidence. At his side was Isabella, stunning in her fitted ivory gown, her delicate hands resting on his arm as she graciously accepted compliments. But Ethan knew better. He had seen her true face, the one she carefully hid from the world. A week ago, Ethan had stumbled upon something that changed everything. His father had left his study door slightly open, and curiosity had drawn Ethan inside. He wasn't normally one to snoop, but he had felt something was wrong for a long time. Ever since Isabella entered their lives, things had been different. His father, once warm and affectionate, had grown distant. His mother, Claire, the woman who had once made their house a home, had vanished from their lives like a ghost. Ethan's fingers had skimmed over the neatly stacked files on his father's desk, his eyes landing on a document labeled Settlement Agreement, Claire Langston. His stomach had twisted in knots as he read through the cold, impersonal words. His mother hadn't left willingly. She had been forced out, paid off to disappear. The deeper he dug, the worse it became. Hidden beneath legal paperwork were bank statements showing large transactions from his father's account, millions wired to Isabella Reed. That night, unable to shake the dread growing inside him, Ethan had followed Isabella when she left the house. He had seen her meet a stranger, a man in an expensive suit. Their conversation had been hushed, but Ethan had recorded it on his phone. "You're marrying him tomorrow," the man had said. "Once you have the ring, we move to the next phase." "Don't worry," Isabella's voice was smooth, dripping with confidence. "William trusts me blindly, and once everything is secured, his fortune is ours." Ethan had felt sick to his stomach. He had run back home, his mind spinning. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it made his hands tremble. Now, as the music swelled and guests took their seats, Ethan clenched his fists. He had held this secret for too long. His mother deserved justice. His father needed to know the truth. And Isabella, she needed to be exposed before she could destroy their family entirely. The officiant stepped forward, his voice echoing across the hall. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the union of William Langston and Isabella Reed." Ethan took a deep breath and slowly stood from his seat. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he took careful, deliberate steps toward the front of the ballroom. The murmur of the guests grew as they noticed the young boy making his way onto the stage. William turned in confusion, his brow furrowing. Isabella's grip on his arm tightened. "Ethan," William said, forcing a smile. "Now's not the time, son. Why don't you—" "No, Dad." Ethan's voice was steady, though his body trembled. He turned to the crowd, his voice growing stronger with every word. "Before you marry her, you need to know the truth about Isabella." A stunned silence fell over the room. Eyes darted between father and son, and even the orchestra, which had been softly playing in the background, came to an abrupt halt. "Ethan," Isabella's voice was controlled, but there was a sharpness to it. "Sweetheart, I know you're nervous, but let's not say things we don't mean." Ethan ignored her. His fingers tightened around his phone. "Dad," he said, looking straight into his father's eyes, "she doesn't love you. She's using you. I have proof." William took a step back as if the words had physically struck him. His face paled. "Ethan, where is this coming from?" "From the truth," Ethan said, pulling out his phone. "You didn't just send Mom away. She was forced out, paid to leave. And Isabella, she's been planning to take your money since the beginning." A collective gasp spread through the guests. Whispers filled the air like rippling waves of shock. William turned to Isabella, his jaw tightening. What is he talking about? Lies. Isabella spat quickly. Her fingers clutched the bouquet so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He's just a child, Will. He doesn't understand. Play it. William interrupted. His voice was calm but dangerously cold. Ethan's fingers trembled as he hit the play button. The ballroom was filled with Isabella's voice. William trusts me blindly, and once everything is secured, his fortune is ours. The room erupted. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into shouts of disbelief. William's face drained of color, and for the first time in his life, he looked truly shaken. Isabella took a step back, her face frozen in horror. That's not, she started, but the damage was done. William turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but Ethan could see it, the flicker of realization, the cold truth settling in his father's eyes. Ethan's heart pounded as he stood in the middle of the storm he had created. He had done it. He had exposed the truth. And now, nothing would ever be the same. A deafening silence filled the grand ballroom. The murmurs that had once been hushed turned into a low wave of scandalized whispers, rippling across the sea of well-dressed guests. The recording of Isabella's voice still lingered in the air, like a ghost of betrayal that refused to be ignored. Ethan stood his ground, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had expected pushback, a dismissive wave of his father's hand, or even Isabella's attempts to twist the situation in her favor. What he hadn't expected was the sheer shock on his father's face, the realization that for the first time, his own son had shattered the illusion he had built around his fiancée. William Langston's hands were trembling. The normally composed billionaire, a man known for his unshakable demeanor in business negotiations, now looked as if the ground beneath him had vanished. What is this? His voice was hoarse, as if the words were scraping against his throat. He turned to Isabella, eyes dark with something dangerous. Betrayal, rage, humiliation. Isabella's face was frozen in horror. Then, suddenly, she laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. She tossed her bouquet onto the floor and smoothed her wedding dress as if she could will away the chaos unraveling around her. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice tight. He's just a child, Will. You're seriously going to believe this over me? William's gaze was unrelenting. The weight of his stare was like an avalanche pressing down on Isabella, crushing any attempts at deceit. Answer me. His tone was deadly. The guests were silent, all eyes locked on the couple at the altar. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, too horrifying to look away from. Ethan swallowed hard. His father was listening. He had never expected that. Isabella's lips parted, but no words came out. The confidence she had always wielded like a weapon was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Her brain was racing, searching for an escape, an excuse, a lie, something. And then, as if struck by inspiration, she turned to Ethan. You little brat, you don't know what you're talking about. Her voice sharpened like a blade. You've never liked me. You and your mother have been trying to turn Will against me from the start. Admit it. She was desperate, and it was showing. Ethan felt a flicker of fear, but he didn't let it show. He had come this far. He wouldn't back down now. He turned to his father, locking eyes with the man who had once adored him, before Isabella had driven a wedge between them. You know I'm telling the truth, Dad. His voice was steady. Check the bank statements. Check the legal agreements. Check anything you want. I found the documents in your study. She made Mom leave. She planned everything. William's breath hitched. The sheer confidence in Ethan's words made the doubt in his heart sink its claws deeper. Then, as if he had suddenly realized he was standing in front of hundreds of guests, he exhaled sharply and ran a hand over his face. Everyone, please leave. Now. His voice cut through the air like glass shattering on the floor. The wedding guests hesitated for only a second before scrambling to exit. No one wanted to be in the middle of the explosion that was about to take place. Photographers and journalists who had been hired to capture the grand wedding of the century were now racing to document the scandal instead. Security guards hurriedly ushered them out before they could make things worse. Within minutes, the ballroom was nearly empty, save for a few close friends, family members, and William's most trusted business associates. And Ethan, the son who had just destroyed his father's wedding. William turned to Isabella. Tell me everything right now. His voice was eerily calm, which made it all the more terrifying. Isabella stiffened. Will, listen. Number you, listen. His voice dropped to lethal quietness. My son just humiliated me in front of my colleagues, my investors, and the press. And yet, I don't feel angry at him. I feel angry at you. Ethan watched as his father's expression hardened, his entire body tensing like a lion ready to strike. You lied to me. His voice was deadly. You used me. That's not true. Isabella tried to move closer, but William took a step back, as if the very sight of her made him sick. Then explain the money. Explain why my son had to find out the truth instead of me. Explain why you said I trust you blindly, while you were plotting behind my back. Silence. Ethan had never seen his father like this before. William was furious, but controlled, which was more terrifying than if he had simply exploded in rage. Isabella's hands trembled at her sides. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had no answer. William exhaled sharply and pulled the diamond ring off his finger. He didn't even hesitate. He simply dropped it. The sound of the ring clattering onto the floor echoed through the empty ballroom. We're done. Isabella's breath hitched. Will, please. We are done. She staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief. You're really going to throw me away like this? William's expression didn't change. Like you threw away my trust? Like you threw away your dignity? Yes. Ethan had never felt more relieved. But Isabella wasn't finished yet. She turned on Ethan, her face twisting in rage. This is all your fault. You just ruined everything, you ungrateful little brat. You'll regret this. She lunged toward him, but before she could get any closer, William stepped in front of his son. If you touch him, Isabella, I swear you won't just lose me. You'll lose everything. The words struck her like a whip. For the first time, fear flickered in her expression. She knew William had the power to bury her completely. The realization settled in. She had lost. After a long moment, Isabella turned on her heel and stormed out of the ballroom, her expensive gown dragging along the floor. William didn't watch her go. Instead, he turned to Ethan, his features still tense but softer than before. For a long moment, father and son just stared at each other. Then finally, William knelt in front of him. I'm sorry. His voice was rough, genuine. For everything. I should have seen it sooner. I should have listened to you. Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that. But before he could respond, his father did something that shocked him even more. William pulled him into a tight embrace. Ethan's chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to sink into his father's warmth. For the first time, his father chose him. And maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to change. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and the joyous clinking of champagne glasses, was now eerily silent. The grand chandeliers overhead illuminated the extravagant venue, but the atmosphere was suffocating, as if the very walls held their breath after witnessing the spectacle that had just unfolded. Ethan, still standing beside his father, felt a wave of emotions crashing over him. Relief, satisfaction, nervousness. His heart pounded in his chest. He had done it. He had exposed Isabella's lies, but now, as the adrenaline began to fade, a new fear settled in. What would happen next? William Langston remained kneeling before his son, his arms still wrapped tightly around him. Ethan could feel the tension in his father's shoulders, the deep, ragged breaths that betrayed the turmoil inside him. William was a man who prided himself on control, yet here he was, visibly shaken by what had just transpired. Ethan hesitated before finally speaking, his voice quiet but firm. Are you okay, Dad? William pulled back slightly, his sharp blue eyes studying his son's face as if seeing him for the first time. There was no anger, no disappointment, only a strange mix of sorrow and regret. I should be asking you that, son, William said, his voice hoarse. He stood up slowly, exhaling deeply as he ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, now slightly disheveled from the chaos. You just stood up to everyone. To me, to Isabella, to an entire room full of people. He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. You shouldn't have had to do that. Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. William turned away briefly, his gaze sweeping across the empty ballroom, the remnants of the ruined wedding. Half-finished glasses of champagne sat abandoned on tables. Expensive floral arrangements toppled over from the rush of guests leaving in a frenzy. The aisle that had been meant for his grand entrance as a groom was now a symbol of his greatest humiliation. He clenched his fists. He had been a fool. For years he had let Isabella manipulate him, whispering lies into his ear, making him believe that Ethan and his mother were the ones tearing the family apart. And yet, It had been Isabella all along. His son had seen the truth before he did. William turned back to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "How did you find out?" Ethan hesitated. He had been dreading this question. I've known for a while," he admitted. "I overheard her talking one night when she thought no one was around. At first I didn't want to believe it, but then I started paying attention. The way she talked about Mom, how she always tried to keep us apart. Then I found the papers." William's brows furrowed. "Papers?" Ethan nodded. "In your study. She had legal documents drawn up that would have made sure Mom could never come back, and she had contracts giving her access to your business accounts. She was making sure that once you married her, she'd be in control of everything." William felt a chill crawl up his spine. Isabella hadn't just been a liar, she had been planning to trap him. His fists tightened at his sides. Ethan shifted uncomfortably under his father's intense gaze. "I knew if I told you before the wedding you wouldn't believe me. You never do." His voice wavered slightly. "So I had to do something you couldn't ignore." A wave of guilt hit William like a hammer. His son was right. If Ethan had come to him privately, he would have brushed it off as childish jealousy. He would have believed Isabella's excuses, the same way he had for years. Ethan had known that. That's why he had chosen to expose Isabella publicly, in front of everyone, because it was the only way William would finally listen. "I was supposed to protect you," William murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. "And instead, you had to protect me." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes wary. He wasn't used to his father admitting when he was wrong. William sighed heavily before placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ethan, but I promise you, from now on, I will listen." Ethan studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Okay." William's chest tightened at the simple response. His son had every right to hate him, yet he was still here, still willing to believe in him even after everything. But there was one more person he needed to make amends to. William pulled out his phone and, without hesitation, dialed a number he hadn't called in far too long. Ethan watched as his father held the phone to his ear, his jaw tense. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, soft yet filled with guarded strength. Ethan held his breath. His mother. William closed his eyes briefly, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "Charlotte, I need to see you." A long pause, and then finally, "So you finally figured it out, didn't you?" William's throat tightened. "Yes." Another pause. Then with a sigh she said, "I'll be there." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His father had spent years pushing his mother away, choosing Isabella over the woman who had once loved him unconditionally. But now, for the first time, maybe he was finally ready to make things right. As William lowered the phone, his expression filled with something Ethan had never seen before: determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and for the first time Ethan believed his father was finally ready to fight for the family he had abandoned. The silence between William and Ethan stretched for what felt like an eternity. The weight of years of mistakes, missed chances, and broken trust hung heavy in the air. But amidst that silence, something had shifted. William was no longer the proud, oblivious billionaire who had dismissed the warnings of those closest to him. He was a man who had just witnessed his entire world crumble in front of an audience. And yet, for the first time in years, he saw clearly. Ethan stole a glance at his father as they sat in the empty wedding hall. The extravagant decorations, the towering floral arrangements, and the untouched wedding cake. All of it was meaningless now. The guests were long gone, leaving only the remnants of what was supposed to be a grand celebration but had turned into a public humiliation. "Dad?" Ethan finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" William exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Now," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now, I fix what I've broken." Ethan studied him warily, unsure if this was yet another empty promise, but something about his father's expression told him that this time it was different. A sudden noise interrupted their moment. The sound of hurried footsteps, sharp and full of fury. Isabella. She stormed into the room, her designer heels clicking against the polished marble floors. Gone was the poised, elegant woman she had portrayed herself to be. In her place stood a furious, unhinged woman whose perfectly curated world had just come crashing down. "You humiliated me," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely restrained rage. Her once beautiful wedding dress was now a wrinkled mess, her makeup smudged from the tears she had tried to suppress in front of the guests. In front of everyone, William. Do you have any idea what you've done? William stood up slowly, his expression eerily calm. I did nothing, Isabella. You did this to yourself. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Oh, please. You're acting like you're some innocent victim. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, narrowing with venom. Your precious son planned this, didn't he? He set me up. Ethan straightened his back but remained silent. There was no point in denying it. William, however, took a step closer to Isabella, his voice dangerously low. No, Isabella. You set yourself up the moment you decided to manipulate me, alienate my son from me, and steal from the company I built. You thought I would never find out, didn't you? Isabella's face paled slightly, but she quickly masked it with another scowl. I did nothing wrong. William pulled out his phone, tapping a few buttons before turning the screen toward her. It was an email, time-stamped and addressed to one of his business associates, one that she had sent under his name. You forged my signature on multiple legal documents, attempted to sell off company assets without my knowledge, and transferred funds to an offshore account that, might I add, is now frozen. Isabella's mouth opened and closed, her mind racing for a way to spin this in her favor. I did it for us, William. You were so caught up in your past, in your pathetic ex-wife and your brat of a son, that I had to do something to protect our future. William let out a slow, bitter chuckle. Our future? Isabella, you were never planning a future with me. You were planning a future for yourself, one where you had my money, my business, and full control. He stepped back, his expression hardening. But you've lost everything. Ethan watched as Isabella's face crumbled. The realization hit her all at once. She had nothing left. No William, no wealth, no reputation. No, you can't do this to me, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. I gave up everything for you. William's lips pressed into a thin line. No, Isabella, you took everything from yourself. Security entered the hall at that moment, waiting for William's cue. With a nod, he gave the silent command. Isabella's face twisted in horror as the guards approached her. You can't just throw me out like some nobody, William. I was going to be your wife. William's gaze was cold and unwavering. No, Isabella, you were just another mistake I refused to see. The guards escorted her out, her shrieks echoing down the grand hallway. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. That was intense. William sighed, sitting back down beside him. It was long overdue. Another pause. Does Mom know what happened? William nodded. She's on her way. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He had fought for years to get his father to see the truth, but his mother had fought even longer, and she had suffered the most. Would she even be willing to hear him out? Would she forgive him? The sound of soft footsteps echoed in the hallway, and both William and Ethan turned toward the entrance. And there she was, Charlotte Langston. She walked in with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, her head held high despite the years of heartache she had endured. She was stunning, yet her eyes held a tiredness that even time couldn't erase. Her gaze flickered to Ethan first, softening immediately as she took him in. Sweetheart, she breathed, crossing the room in an instant and pulling him into a tight embrace. Are you okay? Ethan swallowed back the lump in his throat, nodding as he held on to her. Yeah, I'm okay, Mom. When she finally pulled away, her expression hardened as she turned to William. And for the first time in years, the two of them faced each other. No legal battles, no bitter phone calls, no third parties standing between them. Just them. William exhaled slowly. Charlotte, she held up a hand, stopping him. Before you say anything, let me make one thing very clear. Her voice was firm, unwavering. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm not here to fix you. And I'm certainly not here because I miss you. William's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I understand. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing slightly. Do you? Because I warned you about Isabella, repeatedly. I told you years ago that she was using you, that she wanted nothing but your money and power. But you, she let out a bitter laugh. You called me jealous. William's chest tightened with shame. I was wrong. Charlotte scoffed. That's an understatement. Ethan winced at the sharpness in her voice, but William didn't flinch. He took it, accepted it, because he deserved it. I can't change the past, Charlotte, William said finally, his voice quieter. but I can spend the rest of my life making sure I never make the same mistakes again." Charlotte studied him for a long moment before sighing. "That remains to be seen." Another pause, then, much to Ethan's surprise, she turned back to him with a small smile. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get out of here. We have a lot to talk about." Ethan hesitated, glancing between his parents. His father stood still, watching them with a quiet longing. Charlotte noticed but didn't comment. Instead, she simply said, "William." William nodded. "Charlotte." And just like that, she turned and walked away with Ethan by her side. For now, it was enough. But William Langston wouldn't stop fighting, not for his son, and not for the woman he had let go. He had lost too much already. This time, he would make things right. The ride home was silent. Ethan sat beside his mother in the car, watching as the city lights flickered through the window. Charlotte drove with practiced ease, her grip on the steering wheel firm but relaxed. Despite her calm exterior, Ethan knew her mind was running a marathon of emotions. He could feel the tension in the air, unspoken but present. Finally, Charlotte broke the silence. "I didn't think I'd see your father again like that," she murmured, her voice softer than Ethan expected. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure if she was talking to him or just thinking out loud. "Did it feel the way you expected?" Charlotte let out a breath. It felt worse. Ethan nodded, staring down at his hands. "I'm sorry." She frowned, glancing at him. "Why are you apologizing?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Because I was the one who pushed for this. I wanted him to see the truth, but I didn't think about how it would affect you." Charlotte sighed, reaching over to squeeze his hand gently. "Sweetheart, I appreciate that you care, but this wasn't your mess to clean up. It was his. You did the right thing." Ethan nodded but still felt a pang of guilt. He had spent so many years angry at his father, desperate to prove that he was being deceived. But now, looking at his mother's exhausted expression, he realized that his mission hadn't just been about exposing Isabella. It had been about proving that his mother had never been the villain in this story. She deserved that much. Charlotte pulled into the driveway of their home, a much more modest place compared to the lavish lifestyle she once shared with William. It was smaller but warm, filled with personal touches and memories. Ethan had grown up here after the divorce, and despite everything, it had always felt like home. As they stepped inside, Charlotte kicked off her heels with a sigh. "I need some tea," she muttered, heading toward the kitchen. Ethan followed, knowing she was stalling. "Mom." She paused, her hand hovering over the kettle. He swallowed hard. "Do you think he meant it?" Charlotte slowly turned to face him. "Meant what?" "When he said he wanted to fix things." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Charlotte sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know, Ethan. Your father is a complicated man. He was never cruel, but he was blind. He let his pride lead him into ruin, and it took this for him to wake up." She let out a dry chuckle. "Honestly, part of me doesn't know whether to pity him or just walk away forever." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Would you?" Charlotte studied him, her gaze thoughtful. "Would you want me to?" Ethan hesitated. A few months ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. He had wanted nothing more than for his father to suffer the way his mother had. But after tonight, after seeing William really see his mistakes for the first time, "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I hated him for so long. I wanted him to feel just as abandoned as we did. But now, knowing he regrets it, really regrets it, I don't know if I can just throw him away." Charlotte's lips pressed together, her expression unreadable. "You're a better person than I am." Ethan frowned. "No, I'm not, He stopped, struggling to find the right words. Charlotte sighed and walked over, cupping his face gently. "Ethan, listen to me. Whatever happens next, it's your decision too. If you want to give your father a chance, I won't stop you, but I won't let him hurt you again." Ethan nodded. He knew she meant it. She smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Now let's drink that tea and get some rest. We'll deal with everything else tomorrow." Ethan nodded, but he knew one thing for sure. Tomorrow, he would see his father again. William Langston had spent the entire night in his office, drowning in his own thoughts. The whiskey glass on his desk remained untouched. The documents he had meant to review sat ignored. All he could think about was Ethan, and Charlotte, and everything he had lost. The realization had come too late, far too late. But for the first time, he understood the depth of his mistakes. His son had fought for years to make him see the truth, and he had ignored every warning. He had chosen Isabella over his own blood. And now it had cost him everything. The sound of his office door opening made him glance up. His assistant, Gerald, stepped inside, holding a folder. "Sir, we've completed the full financial investigation on Isabella. The legal team has everything they need to move forward." William nodded stiffly. "Good." Gerald hesitated. "And there's something else." William frowned. "What?" Gerald placed another file on the desk. "It's about Ethan." William straightened immediately. "What about him?" Gerald exhaled. "Sir, for the past few years, Ethan has been working hard to expose Isabella. Not just to you, but to the public. He's been gathering evidence, tracking her financial movements, and even reaching out to sources in the media. He's been doing everything to protect you, even when you didn't believe him." William's throat tightened. "He did all of that." Gerald nodded. "He never stopped, even when you shut him out, even when you told him he was wrong." William felt like someone had punched him in the gut. All this time he had thought Ethan was just being a rebellious, angry kid. But the truth was, Ethan had been fighting for him, and William had been too blind to see it. His hands clenched into fists. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the years of mistakes. But he could still fix this, and he could still fight for his son. William stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. "Prepare the car." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Where are you going, sir?" William's expression was determined. "To see my son." The knock on the door came early the next morning. Ethan rubbed his eyes groggily as he shuffled toward the entrance, expecting a neighbor or a delivery. But when he pulled the door open, he froze. Standing on the porch, looking more exhausted than Ethan had ever seen him, was William Langston. "Dad?" William exhaled slowly. "Hey, kid." Ethan blinked, still processing. "You're here," he muttered. William nodded. "Yeah, I am." They stood there for a long moment, neither one knowing what to say. Finally, William sighed. "I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk?" Ethan studied him carefully. He wasn't sure what his father could say that would change the past, but deep down he wanted to hear it. He wanted to know if his father was truly ready to make things right. "Yeah," Ethan finally said, stepping aside. "Come in." And just like that, the door to the past cracked open. For the first time in years, they were going to face it. Together. Ethan stepped aside, letting William enter their modest home. It was a far cry from the mansion he used to live in, but it was filled with warmth, something William had long forgotten. William glanced around, taking in the cozy living room, the framed pictures on the wall, and the faint smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Everything about this place felt foreign, yet strangely familiar. Ethan crossed his arms and studied his father. "All right," he said cautiously. "Talk." William exhaled, running a hand down his face. He had practiced what he wanted to say all night, but standing here in front of his son, the right words escaped him. "I don't even know where to begin," William admitted, his voice quieter than Ethan had ever heard it. "How about the part where you chose Isabella over us?" Ethan shot back, bitterness creeping into his tone. William flinched, but he nodded. "You're right. That's exactly where I should start." He sighed heavily and sat down on the nearest chair. "Ethan, I failed you. I failed both of you." Ethan hesitated, watching as his father, the once proud, untouchable billionaire, sat slumped in their small living room, looking defeated. "I let my ego, my pride, and my blindness cost me my family," William continued. "I believed Isabella's lies. I turned my back on you and your mother. He swallowed hard. "I let you think I didn't love you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And did you?" William's head snapped up. "Of course I did. Of course I do." Ethan looked away, his emotions a tangled mess. He had spent years believing his father didn't care. Hearing him say otherwise now, after everything, was almost too much. "Then why?" Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "Why did you push us away? Why didn't you listen?" William inhaled shakily. "Because I was a coward." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the admission. "I was afraid of admitting I had made a mistake," William confessed. "I spent so much of my life being right, being in control. I couldn't handle the idea that I had been wrong about her." He clenched his fists. "I thought you were just being difficult, that you were lashing out at me for leaving. But the truth is, you saw what I refused to see." Ethan's chest tightened. "I should have believed you," William whispered, his voice laced with regret. "I should have seen the truth long before that wedding." Ethan swallowed hard. "What changed?" William let out a humorless chuckle. "You did." Ethan frowned. "You stood up there in front of everyone and you told the truth," William said. And for the first time, I really saw you. I saw your strength, your conviction. You weren't just some angry kid lashing out. You were right. Silence stretched between them. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. He wanted to scream, to throw every painful memory back in his father's face, but at the same time, he wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that William had finally changed. "You have no idea what it was like, Dad," Ethan muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "Watching Mom struggle, watching her pretend to be fine when she wasn't, knowing you had moved on like we never mattered." William's face crumbled. "Ethan, do you know how many nights she cried herself to sleep?" Ethan continued, his voice rising. "Do you know how many times I wanted to call you, to beg you to come back, but I didn't, because I knew you wouldn't." William squeezed his eyes shut, pain flashing across his face. "I hated you," Ethan admitted. "I hated you for choosing her over us." William nodded slowly. "I deserve that." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "So why now? Why come back after all this time?" William hesitated, then said the only thing that mattered. "Because I lost everything that truly mattered to me, and I refuse to lose you too." Ethan froze. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," William continued. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to try, if you'll let me." Ethan exhaled shakily, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe his father. He wanted to let go of the resentment, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. "I don't know if I can just let everything go," Ethan admitted. William nodded solemnly. "I don't expect you to. I just want a chance to prove myself." Ethan stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then prove it." For the next few weeks, William did exactly that, and he didn't just say he had changed, he showed it. He made amends with Charlotte, even offering to financially support her despite her refusal. He sold the mansion he once shared with Isabella, choosing a more modest home instead. He cut all ties with Isabella, ensuring she could never manipulate him or his fortune again. But most importantly, he was there. He showed up for Ethan. He attended his school events, took him out for dinner, and even sat with him during late-night conversations about life, the future, and the pain they had both endured. Ethan still held on to his skepticism, but slowly, he began to see something he hadn't before. His father wasn't just trying to make himself feel better. He was trying to be better. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, Ethan finally broke the silence. "You really regret it, don't you?" he asked. William turned to him, his expression solemn. "Every single day." Ethan nodded slowly. "I still don't trust you completely," he admitted. "But I don't hate you anymore." William smiled, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "That's more than I could have asked for." Ethan hesitated, then said, "Mom's starting to forgive you, too." William exhaled deeply. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." A comfortable silence settled between them, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar in his father's presence. Peace. Weeks turned into months, and the fragile truce between Ethan and his father gradually began to take shape. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were still moments of tension, lingering doubts that neither of them could ignore. But at least now, William was trying. For the first time in years, he wasn't just an absentee figure in Ethan's life. He was present. Charlotte, however, remained guarded. While she accepted William's attempts at reconciliation, she never allowed herself to fully trust his words. She had heard promises before. Too many of them had been broken. So when William started showing up unexpectedly at Ethan's soccer games, offering to help with his school projects, and taking him out for meals, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder, was this just guilt, or had he truly changed? One evening, Ethan sat across from her at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. He had been oddly quiet that night, a stark contrast to his usual chatter. Charlotte noticed. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Ethan hesitated before setting his phone down. "Dad wants to take me on a weekend trip." Charlotte tensed, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. "Oh? Yeah," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "He said he wants to make up for lost time. Just him and me." Charlotte carefully placed her coffee cup down. "And what do you think about that?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. I mean, it sounds cool, I guess. But part of me wonders if he's just trying too hard." Charlotte exhaled. "He probably is." Ethan looked up at her. "You don't think I should go?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. I don't want you to get hurt again." Ethan frowned. "I won't." Ethan, it's not that simple. Yes, it is, Ethan argued. I know who he used to be, but I also know who he's trying to be now. Charlotte pressed her lips together. As much as she wanted to protect her son from another heartbreak, she couldn't deny the truth. Ethan had already made up his mind, and deep down she knew this wasn't just about William. This was about Ethan, too. He needed this chance to see for himself whether or not his father was worth forgiving. After a long pause, Charlotte finally nodded. All right, go. Ethan's face lit up, but she held up a warning finger. But if he messes up even once, if he lets you down in any way, you tell me immediately. Got it? Ethan grinned. Got it. That Friday, William pulled up outside their modest home in a sleek black SUV. It was far less flashy than the extravagant sports cars he used to own, but it was still a reminder of his wealth, a wealth that for once he wasn't using to flaunt his status. Charlotte stood at the door as Ethan jogged toward the car, his weekend bag slung over his shoulder. William stepped out, offering Charlotte a hesitant nod. Thank you for trusting me with this. Charlotte crossed her arms. Don't make me regret it. William gave a small, solemn smile. I won't. Ethan slid into the passenger seat, glancing at his father. All right, old man, where are we going? William smirked. Somewhere you'll love. With that, the SUV pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the city streets. The drive was filled with easy conversation. William kept the mood light, avoiding heavy topics that might ruin the trip before it even began. Ethan was still wary, but he wanted to believe this could be good. A few hours later, they arrived at a private lakeside cabin. Ethan's eyes widened as he stepped out of the car, taking in the breathtaking scenery. The water stretched endlessly, reflecting the warm hues of the setting sun. The air smelled crisp and clean, a welcome change from the city's polluted streets. This is where you wanted to bring me? Ethan asked, glancing at his father. William nodded. I figured we could use some quiet, no distractions, just the two of us. Ethan let out a breath, feeling an unexpected wave of appreciation. All right, he said. This is actually kinda cool. William chuckled. I thought you might like it. Over the next few days, the father and son did something they hadn't done in years. They bonded. They went fishing, even though neither of them was particularly good at it. They stayed up late, talking under the stars. They cooked horrible meals together, laughing as they burned pancakes and over-seasoned steaks. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he had his dad back. But there was still something hanging between them. The past. Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready to bring it up. And then one night, William did it for him. They sat by the fire pit, the flames casting flickering shadows over their faces. William sipped his coffee, staring into the embers. Ethan, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Ethan looked up from his marshmallow. Yeah. William hesitated, then finally met his son's gaze. Do you think you'll ever fully forgive me? Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a long moment, he didn't answer. He didn't know how. I don't know, Ethan admitted. I want to, but I can't forget everything that happened. William nodded, accepting the honesty. I don't expect you to forget. He took a deep breath. But I hope someday you'll be able to let go of the anger. Ethan stared at the fire, contemplating. I guess I already have. A little. William's lips parted slightly, surprised. You have? Ethan sighed. Yeah, I mean, I still don't trust you completely, but I don't hate you anymore. A heavy silence settled between them. Then slowly, William smiled. A real, genuine smile. That's more than I deserve. Ethan shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. They sat in silence for a while longer, both knowing that while forgiveness was still a work in progress, they were at least on the right path. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. When they returned from the trip, Charlotte noticed an undeniable change in Ethan. He wasn't as tense when William was around. He didn't glare at him with resentment. It wasn't perfect, but something was different. William was different. And though she would never say it aloud, Charlotte was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, William had finally become the man he should have been all along. But the question remained, would he stay that way? Charlotte wasn't ready to trust him completely, but she was willing to wait and see. Life had settled into an uneasy rhythm. William's efforts to reconnect with Ethan weren't just grand gestures anymore. They were consistent. He showed up when he said he would, called just to check in, and even started attending Ethan's school events. Charlotte watched all of this from the sidelines, still hesitant to believe in his transformation. People don't change overnight. And yet, There was something different about William now, but no matter how much effort he put in, the past still loomed over them all. One evening, Ethan sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly picking at his food. Charlotte noticed the way his brows were furrowed, the way his usual enthusiasm was missing. "You're quiet," she said gently. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Dad wants me to meet his fiancée." Charlotte's grip tightened around her fork. Samantha, the woman William had left her for. Charlotte had done everything in her power to keep her emotions in check whenever Ethan mentioned William's new life. She never spoke ill of him in front of their son. She never let her bitterness show. But this was pushing her limits. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice carefully controlled. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, I know, but I kind of feel like I should." Charlotte swallowed back the initial protest that threatened to rise. "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know, maybe to see what kind of person she really is. Maybe to understand why he chose her over us." Charlotte's heart clenched at those words. He was still searching for answers, still wondering what made Samantha so much more worth it than the family William had walked away from. And that hurt more than anything. She took a deep breath. "All right, but if you ever feel uncomfortable, you leave. Understand?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I got it." But Charlotte wasn't sure she was ready for this. A few days later, Ethan sat across from William and Samantha at an upscale restaurant. The setting was lavish, eerily familiar to the places William used to take Charlotte when they were still together. Samantha was exactly as Ethan expected, polished, poised, and picture-perfect. She had the kind of beauty that looked effortless, her golden hair swept into an elegant updo, her expensive jewelry subtle yet deliberate. She smiled warmly at Ethan. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Your father talks about you all the time." Ethan forced a polite smile. "Nice to meet you too." William cleared his throat. "I know this is a little awkward, but I wanted the two of you to get to know each other. Samantha's going to be a part of my life, which means—" Ethan cut him off. "Which means I have to accept her." The table went silent. William sighed. "Ethan, that's not what I meant." Ethan crossed his arms. "Look, I came here because I wanted to see for myself, but let's not pretend this is some happy family gathering." Samantha shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan, I understand if you're upset." "Do you?" Ethan asked sharply. "Do you really understand? Because I don't think you do." William's jaw tightened. "Ethan." "No, let him speak," Samantha said, her voice softer than expected. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. I don't get it. I don't get how my dad could throw away everything we had for you. And no offense, but I don't get why you would want to be with someone who did that." Samantha's expression flickered, just for a second, a brief moment of hesitation before she recovered. "Sometimes things don't happen the way we expect them to." Ethan scoffed. "That's a nice way of saying people make selfish choices." William ran a hand through his hair. "Ethan, I've told you before, I made mistakes. But this isn't about the past. This is about moving forward." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "And you expect me to just accept it?" "No," William admitted, "but I was hoping you'd try." Ethan glanced between them, his stomach twisting in knots. He could see it in Samantha's eyes. She wasn't as confident as she pretended to be. And in that moment something clicked. This wasn't a fairy tale romance. This wasn't some perfect love story. William had left one family for another, but that didn't mean he was truly happy. Ethan saw the cracks, the unspoken tension between them, and suddenly, the anger he had been carrying for so long started to fade. Not because he forgave his father completely, but because he realized something important. His father wasn't the man he had once admired, and maybe he never had been. Later that night, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He had spent years wanting answers. Now he had them. And strangely, they didn't feel as satisfying as he thought they would. Charlotte knocked on the door. "How did it go?" Ethan let out a tired chuckle. "Not great, but I think I get it now." Charlotte tilted her head. "Get what?" Ethan sighed. "That he's just a guy who made really bad choices, and that I don't need to understand why anymore." Charlotte walked over, brushing a hand through his hair like she used to when he was little. "That's a big realization." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I think I'm done waiting for him to fix everything." Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. "That's okay. You don't have to wait for anything." Ethan looked up at her, his voice quieter. "Are you still waiting?" Charlotte froze. For so long she had told herself she was just protecting Ethan, that she wasn't still hung up on the past. But now, sitting here, looking at the son she had raised on her own, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go too. She smiled. Number I'm not. Ethan studied her face, and for the first time in years, he believed her. Maybe William had been their past, but he wasn't their future, and they were finally ready to move on. A week had passed since Ethan's meeting with William and Samantha, yet the weight of it still clung to him. He hadn't spoken much about it, and Charlotte hadn't pushed him. She knew the answers he had found weren't the ones he had wanted. Instead, she let him process it in his own time, knowing that one day he would truly understand that closure didn't always come wrapped in a perfect explanation. But the past had a strange way of lingering. Charlotte knew this better than anyone. She had spent years holding on, not just to the pain, but to the hope that somehow William would come back different, stronger, wiser, regretful. Yet the more she saw of him, the more she realized that he was none of those things. The man she had loved was never coming back. And maybe he never really existed in the first place. The thought should have been painful, but strangely, it felt like freedom. That morning she stood in front of the mirror staring at her reflection. The woman who looked back at her wasn't the same one who had once cried herself to sleep over a man who chose another. No, this woman had survived. She had raised a son on her own. She had built a life from the ashes, and now for the first time in years she was ready to live again. There was just one last thing to do. Charlotte sat across from William at a quiet cafe, the same one where, years ago, he had broken her heart. Only this time she wasn't here to beg for answers. She was here to say goodbye. William leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same lazy confidence he always had. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this. Charlotte stirred her coffee, her movements calm and deliberate. I think we've spent enough time avoiding this conversation. William smirked. And what conversation is that? Charlotte looked him in the eye, unflinching. The one where I tell you that I'm finally done. His smirk faltered slightly. You make it sound like you've been waiting for me all this time. Charlotte let out a soft chuckle. That's the thing, William. I used to think I was, but now I realize I was just waiting for myself to be ready to walk away. William's expression turned unreadable. You're serious? I am. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I guess I deserve that. Charlotte tilted her head. It's not about what you deserve. It's about what I deserve. And I deserve a life where I don't waste another second wondering if you'll ever realize what you lost. For the first time, William looked unsettled. He had always assumed Charlotte would be there, even if only in the background. But now she was closing the door, for good. You really mean this, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Charlotte nodded. I do. William sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, I guess I wish you the best. Charlotte smiled. For the first time, I actually believe that. She stood up, gathering her things, and with one final glance at the man who had once been her everything, she walked away, this time without looking back. Ethan noticed the difference in his mother immediately. She smiled more, laughed easier, and most of all, she stopped flinching whenever William's name came up. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan nudged her lightly. So, you finally did it, huh? Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Did what? Let go. She exhaled, a soft smile playing on her lips. Yeah, I think I did. Ethan grinned. Took you long enough. Charlotte laughed, shaking her head. You're one to talk. You held on to your dad for years, hoping he'd magically turn into someone he's not. Ethan shrugged. Guess we both had to figure it out in our own time. Silence settled between them, comfortable and warm. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt the weight of the past. Because the future was finally theirs. The days that followed were unlike any Charlotte or Ethan had ever experienced. Lighter, brighter. The kind of days that weren't burdened by memories of what had been lost, but instead filled with anticipation for what lay ahead. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt a sense of peace she had once believed was out of reach. She had spent too long looking backward, replaying mistakes, questioning her choices, and mourning a life she thought she had lost. But now she had finally moved forward, and in doing so, she had made space for something new. One afternoon, Charlotte sat on the back porch of their home, flipping through an old journal she had abandoned years ago. It was filled with dreams she had once dared to have. Plans, sketches, ideas. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that she had ever wanted more for herself, that she had once been ambitious, that she had dreamed of creating something of her own. She ran her fingers over the faded ink and whispered to herself, "Why did I ever stop?" Ethan's voice called from inside. "Mom, phone's ringing." Charlotte smiled, setting the journal aside as she went inside to answer. She picked up the phone. "Hello?" A familiar voice greeted her on the other end. "Charlotte, it's Richard Kingston." She blinked in surprise. Richard. Richard Kingston was an old friend from college, someone she had once shared long conversations with about business and design before her life had taken a different turn. He had built a successful brand in sustainable fashion, and she had once dreamed of doing the same. But marriage, motherhood, and heartbreak had derailed those plans. Until now. "I know it's been a long time," Richard said, his voice warm. "But I saw your name pop up in an article recently, and I remembered something." Charlotte chuckled. "What's that?" "You once told me you wanted to build something with meaning, something that stood for more than just profit. I never forgot that." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. "I barely remember saying that." "Well, I do, and I was wondering, do you still want that?" She swallowed. "I don't know if I'm the same person anymore." Richard laughed. "None of us are, but I have a feeling that the part of you who wanted to create something never really left." Charlotte exhaled, gripping the phone a little tighter. "What are you saying, Richard?" "I have an opening on my team, a partnership opportunity. I need someone with your vision." Charlotte felt her chest tighten, not in fear, but in excitement. It had been years since she had allowed herself to feel that. She glanced out the window, where Ethan was playing basketball in the driveway, his laughter echoing through the warm afternoon. For years she had put herself last. For Ethan, for survival, for fear of failing again. But maybe it was time to bet on herself. Charlotte smiled. "Tell me more." Ethan noticed the change in his mother almost immediately. She had always been strong, but now there was something different about her. She was alive again. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen eating dinner, he leaned forward, resting his chin on his palm. "So, what's going on with you?" Charlotte arched an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You've been glowing lately." She laughed. "Glowing?" Ethan nodded. "Like, happy glowing. You've got that I'm about to do something crazy look." Charlotte smirked, taking a sip of her wine. "Well, maybe I am." Ethan grinned. "Is it a good kind of crazy?" "The best kind." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Let me guess. It has something to do with that phone call you got last week." Charlotte shook her head. "When did you get so nosy?" "I'm your son. It's in my job description." She exhaled, setting down her fork. "You're right. It's about an opportunity. Something I put on hold a long time ago." Ethan's eyes lit up. "You mean your business, your fashion ideas?" Charlotte nodded. He sat up straighter. "Mom, that's amazing." She smiled softly. "It is, but it's also terrifying." Ethan reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You always tell me to go after what I want. Maybe it's time you listen to your own advice." Charlotte chuckled, squeezing his hand back. "Maybe you're right." The night before her first meeting with Richard's team, Charlotte stood in front of the mirror, dressed in an elegant but simple outfit. She looked at herself differently now, not as William's ex-wife, not as the woman who had once been humiliated, but as Charlotte Emerson, a woman with her own dreams, her own path, and a future that no longer belonged to the ghosts of her past. As she stepped outside to her car, Ethan called from the doorway. "Mom!" She turned, laughing. "What?" Ethan grinned. "You're gonna kill it today." Charlotte felt a swell of emotion in her chest. "You think so?" He smirked. "I know so." She smiled. "Thanks, kid." With that, she got in her car and drove off, toward something new, toward something hers. And for the first time in years, she wasn't running away from the past. She was racing toward the future. Final scene, a different kind of victory. Months passed. Charlotte built her business with Richard's team, thriving in ways she had never imagined. She no longer cared about William's opinions, society's whispers, or the past she had left behind. She was successful on her own terms. And then, one evening, as she walked into a gala celebrating the launch of her company's latest project, she saw him, William, standing across the room, watching her with an expression that was no longer dismissive, no longer cruel. but regretful. Charlotte felt nothing but peace. She smiled at him, not out of longing, not out of spite, but because she had won in a way he could never have predicted. Not with revenge, not with anger, but by simply becoming the woman she was always meant to be. And that was the best revenge of all. The end. Did this story inspire you? If you loved Charlotte's journey, let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and redemption. Resilience and redemption. Resilience and redemption.